Welcome back to Unleashed on TNT with Mark Morano. All right, we're joined now by Michael Austin, Project 21 member, the National Center for Public Policy Research. He's a free market economist and the president of Knowledge and Decisions Economic Consulting. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Good to be here, Mark. Thanks a lot.
All right, well, let's talk about Biden first of all, and specifically economic. Is America better off than we were 4 years ago? Because it's kind of an unfair question because we were coming out of the COVID lockdowns. And the next sub question is African Americans better off than they were? How are they doing under Joe Biden's presidency?
Well, so I think maybe a few months ago, Biden and his press secretary, toured the nation as they're probably doing now. And they're talking about how Bidenomics has created an economy that works for everyone. Well, I honestly think that only works to the extent a Band-Aid might, work for a gunshot wound. I mean, the reality is that nearly every economic indicator shows that Americans are worse off than where they were 4 years ago. And nowhere is that more true than with African Americans.
I know when Donald Trump was president, there was like the lowest Hispanic and Black unemployment, I think, ever measured since like 1967 or 68 or something like that. Is that around the same stat, or how is that doing? And what has his policy specifically done to harm African Americans?
No, that is no longer the case. Under Bidenomics now, we have created an economy that pays you for not working. We have created an economy that pushes, these Green New Deals and electric vehicles and green this and green that without really getting your permission. And we have spent, bundles of cash into the economy. And that has led to not only rising unemployment, a direct contrast to the stat that you just mentioned about Black unemployment about 4 years ago, but it's also led to record inflation. So, these victories that the Biden administration wants to claim, it's just not resonating with African Americans. I think there was a poll out there that said about 35% are disapproving of his economic management. Home ownership, right, between whites and Black Americans is now diverged about 30 points. And then to end on unemployment, Black unemployment has risen by 23% since April 2023, contrasting with a steady white unemployment rate. So, he can talk, all sorts of numbers and pleasantries and poetry as much as he likes. But the reality is African Americans and most Americans don't feel like they're better off.
What do you attribute the big rise in, you said it was diverging by 30 points. Why, since 2023, is African American unemployment rising so high, you think?
Well, it's simply because government has gotten way too big. When Biden came into office, he's instituted many policies that have just made it much easier to not work, where he has loosened federal unemployment money so people can continue to receive those checks without barely looking for work, or whether you think about the amount of money that government has spent into the economy, which is naturally pushing prices higher. And then probably the biggest thing when it comes to home ownership is what he's directed the Federal Reserve to do. The Federal Reserve has simultaneously, inflated the economy, and now it's trying to deflate the economy because it did way too much. And so naturally, when we've had low interest rates for so long, thanks to the Biden administration and even going all the way back to Obama, with interest rates now high, that has pushed mortgage rates up and made it really harder for people to leave apartments or leave the cities and go to suburbia or go to a home. And so that would naturally affect those lower income, which tend to be African Americans. But that just goes to show that when you have big government, all you're going to create are big consequences.
Well, no, it seems as though the Democratic Party historically has African Americans have, 90% plus have voted for the Democratic Party just generally. And I think the Democratic Party has always prided itself on expanding, the Great Society, welfare programs, government spending, and they'll brag about, well, we're directing this toward, African American. Is that really what African Americans want? Is more government aid, welfare funding, special projects, or do they want more the chance for economic growth and opportunity? And why do Democrats, it seems like their first instinct is to spend more government money and claim that they're helping African Americans?
Well, I'll say this. Of course, I can't speak for all African Americans. I can only speak to just me, myself, being an American. But what I can say is that it really doesn't matter whether you're white, Black, brown, yellow, what have you.
Yeah.
Most Americans just want it to be easier to live.
Yeah.
So when they go to the grocery store, you know, they want to make sure that they have enough money to pay for the groceries, to pay for produce, to pay for, you know, bread and things of that sort. When they go to the gas pump, they want to feel confident that they have enough money to fill up a tank so that they can go to work the next day. They just want life to be easier. And when it comes to, you know, the progressives, what they really want is to control. But what they don't want to realize, of course, is that by instituting that control, they create so many unintended negative consequences that it makes life harder. And so there's a massive disconnect, right? You have many American communities that just want, you know, they just want to get by. They just want to, you know, take their kids to school. They just want to go to the movies. They just want to live their life. And then you have the progressives who want to use government to control everybody. And it's creating all these disastrous effects. And I think what we're seeing in the African American community is that, you know, they're willing to consider, you know, people pushing conservative policies if it means that it gets government out of their hair.
Yeah. What do you make of these recent, polling, and the mainstream media is lamenting over the fact that Donald Trump is getting the highest percentage of African American votes of any Republican nominee pretty much in history, I want to say. What is the appeal there? And is it a reflection of Donald Trump's policies or more a rejection of Joe Biden? I mean, even unexpectedly, like famous rappers and other celebrities are supporting Donald Trump. Is that just a personality of Trump, you think, or is it a policy basis?
Why not both? I mean,
Yeah.
I think you can definitely point to the policies, you know, just making life more affordable for your family, making life more affordable if you're running a business. That obviously has a play. And then I think, you know, culturally, you have to look at what the progressives are saying, what, you know, what these liberals are saying, and what the other side is saying. You know, you have the pushing of the welfare state by Democrats and progressives, and you also have this woke culture, you know, in society today that kind of demonizes men. And it doesn't really care whether you're white, brown, or whatever. If you're a man, you know, this woke culture kind of pushes against that. And so I think that's one reason why even African American men continue to move more and more to voting Republican. One, because they notice the policies are actually better for them, better for their families, better for their neighborhood, but also it's a repudiation of what they're seeing from the woke left, which seems to hate men just because of what's between their legs.
Yeah. And well, until you mentioned woke and you mentioned men between their legs, is the African American community, is the Asian American community, are these other communities, are they involved at all or supportive of this woke agenda, things like transgenderism, or is that sort of more the subject of, I hate to be this race conscious, but white, wealthy, wealthy kids who go to elite universities? Where is that coming from? And how do minority groups in America react to sort of the woke agenda, i.e. specifically, well, critical race theory and the transgender agenda?
Well, I think, you know, you can find different Americans having different opinions on this, but kind of just what I've already highlighted, right? Where you see this woke culture kind of shunning men, right?
Yeah.
Putting, you know, feminism more and more on this pedestal to the detriment of men. And men feel like, you know, they're being pushed out of a conversation, which makes no sense. At the same time, you know, DEI and these woke policies are pushing a type of affirmative action, and it's creating type of discrimination. You know, it used to be that if you wanted to get into Harvard, you know, you needed to have good grades, you need to be well-rounded, you need to have all these other activities, extracurricular activities, you need to be one of the best students in the country. Now, you just need to not be Asian. In order to get into Harvard. And so it's a type of policy that has created such a negative stereotype on all different sorts of Americans when before it used to be based off of merit. And I think there are a number of Americans that are just naturally, you know, bristling at that fact, and wanting to turn away from that type of policy because it's not fair to everyone and it doesn't give people a chance to succeed if they really want to.
Well, how do we get out of this at this point? I mean, we are untold debt, for U.S. history, untold spending, printing of money, modern monetary theory. You have the most incredibly regulatory state, a permission-based society. It's just getting worse. The intentional restrictions on agriculture. We see the farmers protesting, blue-collar workers throughout Europe against the net zero agenda. And of course, they're destroying freedom of movement. They're raising the cost of transportation, automobiles. They're banning gas-powered cars, and most people can't afford an electric car. It's insane, and it's not practical. And then, of course, you have what they're doing in just energy alone. I remember years ago, Niger Innis and African-American ministers were protesting Robert Redford for raising the cost of energy. It seems like everything is wrong for the middle class and the working class and blue-collar Americans. How do we get out of this mess? And were we out of this mess? I mean, pre-COVID, it seemed like, evaluate Donald Trump's 3 years before COVID. How did that go? It seemed like that would be like the halcyon days of economic policy. At least, of course, he was an overspender as well, but in deficits. But continue. I'm sorry. It's a long question, but take it what you will. I'm
No, you're completely
sermonizing here
fine.
for some reason.
I do think that there is a solution out there, and that solution is elimination without replacement. The great economist Thomas Sowell, he likened bad policy to a house fire. When you put out a house fire, the next step is not to figure out what you're going to replace the fire with. You've already done the work. You've already done the good job. You stopped the bad things from happening. And so that same thing goes with public policy. Killing bad policies is just as good as creating a whole new one. And the fundamental truth is that, Bidenomics, I think, should be discarded to history's trash heap. It is clear that it is, only focused on, serving out particular special interests or serving whatever particular pet projects Joe Biden has, but it doesn't really do anything to most Americans. And in fact, it's like taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It creates so many unintended consequences, like high inflation, a decrease in home ownership, high prices at the grocery store or at the pump. What you really need to do is that if government gets you into this mess, the only way out is for government to back away.
It just seems like that's becoming harder and harder to even envision, especially post-COVID, because the economic chaos that these lockdowns happen with supply chains, inflation, spending, then of course the Ukraine war, and the idea that you would go pay higher gas and say, I'm sticking it to Putin as you're pumping in $4.50 a gallon gas. Who thinks that way? I mean, it is. Why do you? Let's talk about that disconnect. There seems such a disconnect between our leaders, academia, the corporate media, and the middle class, working class, blue collar Americans. How did that happen? And is that just basically throughout the ages? I guess there's always been somewhat of a disconnect, but it seems to be really being focused now, and it almost seems to be much more sinister than it has been, in at least in our lifetimes.
Sure. I think it really comes from the fact that government is much larger than it used to be. Here in America, we've been around since 1776. If you look at the history of our country, from before the Great Depression, we've had recessions before, but only if you're a history major, only if you're a historian, could you ever tell me the name of the recessions that we've had in the 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s? No one knows what those things are. And the reason why is because those recessions, when they happened, as horrible as they were, they left so quickly. And I'll tell you something else, that when those recessions happened, governments never got involved. They never decided to spend more in order to try to boost the economy or increase taxes. If anything, they actually decreased taxes in recession in order to get them out. The only time, right, where we had started counting how bad recessions were was starting in FDR, or starting in the 1930s, where FDR implemented the New Deal and exacerbated the 1928 stock market crash way beyond what we have ever seen. And ever since then, society has had this idea in its head that it needs to control in order to get out of recession, when in reality, businesses adapt and they find ways to get out of these things by themselves. So, if today's culture, it's all about corporate media or populists or this and that, they're all lobbying the government because government has gotten way too big for the people. And by doing that, instead of focusing, let's say, on making products that really help out customers, the corporations are lobbying government for a special deal. And the same thing goes with politics. When government has become so big, so large, so massive, all of our attention is now directed towards it. And instead of working with each other, we're using government to go after those who we disagree with.
Wow. All right. Well, we're talking with Michael Austin, free market economist with Project 21 for the National Center for Public Policy Research. We'll be right back after these messages, continuing the discussion on Unleashed with Marc Morano on TNT.